She never thought love was meant for her. Emma Carter spent her whole life running from her fears, from her past, from the idea that she could ever be enough. Then she met Dr. Lucas Bennett, wealthy, confident, and completely out of her league. Or so she thought. But Lucas wasn't chasing perfection. He was chasing her. And no matter how hard she tried to push him away, he refused to leave. Will Emma finally let herself be loved? Or will fear steal her chance at happiness? Where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heart-stirring stories. Emma Carter gripped the clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. The waiting room of Westwood Women's Clinic was sleek and modern, designed to feel comforting, but no amount of soft lighting or instrumental music could ease the anxiety twisting in her stomach. She hated being here. Her heart pounded as she stared at the intake form. Name, date of birth, medical history. Simple questions, but her mind felt like a scrambled mess. Her fingers trembled as she wiped her clammy hands against her jeans, forcing herself to focus. Just fill out the form, Emma. It's not that hard. But it was. She had spent years avoiding this moment, convincing herself she didn't need to see a gynecologist. But after weeks of discomfort and late-night Google searches that only fueled her worst fears, she had finally given in. The receptionist had highly recommended Dr. Lucas Bennett. One of the best in the city, she'd said. Emma hadn't thought much about it at the time. A doctor was just a doctor. Old, professional, clinical. That's what she had expected. A nurse stepped into the waiting room holding a file. Emma Carter? Emma nearly jumped out of her chair. Her stomach clenched as she swallowed hard, gripping the form like it was a lifeline. With wobbly legs, she stood and followed the nurse down the quiet hallway, her nerves heightening with every step. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, the muffled sounds of distant conversations barely registering in her ears. "You can have a seat," the nurse said with a kind smile, gesturing toward a chair inside the doctor's office. "Dr. Bennett will be in shortly." Emma nodded but could barely breathe. She perched on the edge of the chair, her back rigid, hands clasped in her lap. The room was pristine. Framed medical certificates lined the walls. A sleek desk stood in the corner, and beside it, the dreaded exam chair loomed like something out of a horror movie. She forced herself not to stare at it, fingers twisting together anxiously. Be calm. Be normal. Just get through this. Then the door opened, and Emma forgot how to breathe altogether. The man who stepped inside was not the doctor she had pictured in her head. Dr. Lucas Bennett was devastatingly handsome. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features that looked like they belonged on the cover of a magazine. His dark brown hair was neatly styled, slightly tousled in a way that looked effortless, and his piercing blue eyes held an easy confidence. He was not supposed to look like this. "Miss Carter?" His voice was smooth, calm, completely professional. He offered her a reassuring smile as he shut the door behind him, his movements unhurried. Emma's throat went dry. She tried to answer, but nothing came out. She was too busy panicking. He was young. He was attractive. He was about to examine her. Oh, God. Lucas sat across from her, flipping through her file. "I see this is your first visit to a gynecologist." Emma nodded so quickly she nearly gave herself whiplash. His smile remained gentle. "I know this can be nerve-wracking, but I promise we'll take things at your pace. Nothing happens unless you're comfortable." She nodded again, her cheeks burning. Lucas noticed the way she tensed, how she avoided his gaze, how she looked like she wanted to sink into the chair and disappear. He had seen plenty of nervous patients before, but something about Emma was different. She was shy, hesitant, in a way that made something in him stir. A quiet urge to be careful with her, to earn her trust. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softer. "How are you feeling?" Emma clenched her hands together. "Fine," she lied. Lucas chuckled, a warm, easy sound. "You don't have to be. I promise I'm not that scary." She begged to differ. He was terrifying, not because of who he was, but because of what he was making her feel. Her heart was racing, her palms were sweating, and she was hyper-aware of every single move he made. And the worst part, Lucas noticed. He caught the way she stiffened whenever his gaze lingered on her, the way her fingers fidgeted, the pink flush on her cheeks. She was adorable. Different from most patients he saw, who were usually either confident or just eager to get the appointment over with. Some even flirted shamelessly. But Emma was something else entirely. Lucas had never been the type to mix emotions with work, but something about her made him want to be careful, and that was dangerous. He cleared his throat, pushing the thought aside. "Focus, Lucas. You're her doctor, not some guy trying to impress her." "Before we begin," he said lightly, "do you have any questions for me?" Emma hesitated. She had a million questions, but her brain refused to cooperate. So she just shook her head. Lucas studied her for a moment, as if trying to decode the silence between them. Then he smiled again, effortlessly professional. "All right," he said, "let's get started." And Emma knew, without a doubt, that this was going to be the longest appointment of her life. Emma practically sprinted out of the clinic the moment the appointment ended. She didn't stop until she reached the street, where she sucked in a deep breath, her heart still hammering against her ribs. The cool air did little to calm the fire burning in her cheeks. Never in her life had she felt so out of place, so unbearably awkward. Dr. Lucas Bennett was too much, too handsome, too confident, too composed, and worst of all, too kind. She could have handled arrogance. She could have handled indifference. But the way he had looked at her, with quiet patience and understanding, had completely thrown her off. She should have been relieved that the appointment was over. Instead, she felt like she had barely survived it. On the way home, she replayed every humiliating second in her head. The way her voice had trembled, the way she had barely been able to look at him. And God, the way he had smiled at her, like he actually cared whether or not she was comfortable. She groaned, covering her face with her hands as she climbed the stairs to her small apartment. No, nope. Absolutely not. She was never going back there again. Emma dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto her couch, exhaling shakily. The feeling of vulnerability from that room still clung to her, making her restless. She needed to do something, anything, to push it away. She grabbed her laptop, fully intending to drown herself in work. But as soon as she opened it, her mind betrayed her. Instead of pulling up her editing projects, she found herself typing a name into the search bar. Dr. Lucas Bennett. Her fingers hovered over the keys. "No," she scolded herself. "This is a terrible idea." But curiosity had already won. She hit enter. Hundreds of search results appeared. Medical journals, news articles, interviews. She clicked on one without thinking. Dr. Lucas Bennett, the pioneer in women's health and the millionaire philanthropist behind Westwood Medical Group. Her stomach twisted. She kept reading. Lucas wasn't just a doctor. He was the doctor, one of the leading specialists in gynecology, a key figure in women's healthcare reform. He had founded multiple clinics, donated millions to research, and her breath caught. He came from money, old money, the kind that people only whispered about. Emma stared at the screen, her heart sinking. She had been so naive. For a brief, fleeting second, she had let herself think of him as just a person. A doctor with a reassuring smile and kind words. But he wasn't just anyone. He was a millionaire. A name that meant something. Someone important. And she, She was just Emma Carter, a freelance book editor barely scraping by, a woman who got nervous filling out a simple medical form, a nobody. A laugh bubbled up in her throat, but it wasn't funny. She clicked out of the article and shut her laptop, her fingers gripping the edges of it tightly. She could never go back there. For the next 2 weeks, she ignored every call from the clinic. When they left messages about her prescription needing an adjustment, she deleted them. When they suggested scheduling a follow-up, she scoffed. Not happening. She convinced herself she was fine. Until she wasn't. The discomfort returned, worse this time. No amount of the counter remedies helped, and her late-night Google searches only made her spiral further into panic. She didn't want to go back. She couldn't. But avoiding it wasn't making it go away. And that was how she found herself once again, sitting in the waiting room of Westwood Women's Clinic, gripping the arms of her chair like they might keep her from fleeing. This time, she silently begged for a different doctor. Someone older, someone boring, someone who wouldn't make her stomach twist in knots. The door opened. Emma Carter. Her breath caught in her throat. Of course, of course. Of course, life hated her. She followed the nurse down the hall with leaden steps. When she entered the office, she barely managed to lift her gaze from the floor. Emma, a familiar voice greeted her. Slowly, she looked up. Lucas sat at his desk, flipping through a file. When he saw her, he smiled, a slow, knowing smile. I was starting to think you were avoiding me. Her stomach twisted painfully. She dropped into the chair, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. I wasn't. Lying through her teeth. Lucas leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk, his expression both amused and curious. You missed your follow-up, he pointed out. And when we called, you didn't answer. Emma felt like she was dying. She forced herself to shrug. I got busy. Lucas didn't believe her for a second. He studied her, and the silence stretched unbearably long. Finally, he leaned back, his gaze still steady on her. Glad you're here, he said simply. Emma swallowed hard. She wasn't sure she was. Emma had barely survived her second appointment. The moment she stepped out of the clinic, she felt like she could finally breathe again. Her pulse was still racing, her skin still warm with embarrassment. Somehow, sitting across from Dr. Lucas Bennett, knowing he had noticed her nervousness, had been even worse than the first time. It wasn't just the fact that he was good-looking, unfairly good-looking. It was the way he spoke to her, the way he saw her. She hated how much it affected her. She hated how much it affected her. She hated that even now, hours later, his voice still lingered in her mind. She needed to get a grip. Emma buried herself in work for the rest of the day, determined to push everything about that appointment out of her head. By the time she finished her editing tasks, exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. The next morning, craving some peace and quiet, she grabbed her book and headed to her favorite cafe, a small, tucked away spot with the perfect balance of cozy and quiet. She ordered her usual latte, found a seat by the window, and let herself get lost in the pages of her novel. It was the first time in days that she felt normal again, until a shadow fell across her table. Fancy seeing you here. Her entire body tensed. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her gaze. And there he was, Lucas Bennett, standing right in front of her, looking effortlessly put together in a crisp dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His sharp blue eyes glinted with something unreadable as he studied her reaction. Emma froze mid-sip, her fingers tightening around her cup. Then she choked. The coffee burned as it slid down the wrong way, and she coughed violently, desperately trying to recover. Lucas, to his credit, did not laugh, but his lips twitched, and the amusement in his eyes was impossible to miss. Emma wanted the ground to swallow her whole. She set down her cup, cleared her throat, and managed to rasp out, "Dr. Bennett." He tilted his head. "We're outside the clinic. You can just call me Lucas." She nodded stiffly, willing herself to stay calm, to act normal. Lucas, meanwhile, slid into the seat across from her without asking, as if this were completely natural, as if they had been running into each other for years. "I had no idea you came here," he said, glancing around. "This is my usual spot." Of course it was. Emma swallowed hard. "I like the quiet." Lucas smiled, resting his arms on the table. "Me too." A silence settled between them, and for the first time, Emma allowed herself to really look at him. Not as a doctor. Not as a man who made her feel like an awkward mess. Just as a person. Up close, she noticed things she hadn't before. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, as if he smiled often. The way his watch sat comfortably on his wrist, expensive but not flashy. The way he seemed completely at ease, while she was barely holding it together. He didn't belong in her world. And yet, here he was. "I didn't take you for a fiction reader," he said suddenly, nodding at her book. Emma blinked, glancing down at the novel in her hands. "You thought I only read medical journals?" she asked dryly. Lucas smirked. "I thought you might be more of a non-fiction person. Something practical." She raised an eyebrow. "And what do you read then?" "Mostly research papers," he admitted, then shrugged. "But when I actually read for fun, I like mystery novels." That surprised her. "You?" she asked skeptically.
"Mr. Perfect Doctor reads mysteries."
Lucas chuckled. "Are you saying I don't look like the type?" Emma hesitated. She had seen him as a lot of things. Intimidating, untouchable, out of reach. But never ordinary. Never just a guy who liked to lose himself in a good book. She wasn't sure what to do with that. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, a reminder for a payment deadline. Reality crashed back in. She was sitting across from a man who owned multiple hospitals. A man whose presence alone made her nerves tangle into knots. A man she had no business getting comfortable around. Emma cleared her throat, straightening. "Well, Lucas studied her for a beat, as if sensing the shift in her demeanor. Then he nodded, not pushing. "See you around, Emma." His voice was light, but something about the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. Because for the first time, she wondered if she would see him again. And more importantly, if she wanted to. Emma told herself she wouldn't think about him. That running into Dr. Lucas Bennett at the cafe was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. That the way he had smiled at her across the table, his presence so effortlessly at ease, while she was one misstep away from full-blown panic, meant nothing. She repeated these thoughts over and over, hoping they would somehow become true. But they didn't. Because even days later, the moment she closed her eyes, she saw him. The way he had looked at her, not like a doctor analyzing a patient, not like a man amused by her awkwardness, but like someone who noticed her, really saw her. And that scared the hell out of her.
So she did what she always did when things felt too big, too overwhelming. She distracted herself.
She threw herself into work, editing manuscript after manuscript until the words blurred together. She cleaned her apartment twice in one day, reorganized her bookshelf, and even made a to-do list for the next 2 weeks. None of it helped. Because late one night, long past the point where she should have been sleeping, she did something she never should have done. She Googled him. At first, it was just curiosity. A tiny, reckless part of her wanted to see if there was anything about him that made sense. What she found made her stomach drop. Dr. Lucas Bennett, the millionaire doctor, redefining women's health care. She clicked on the first article, her heart pounding. Lucas Bennett, 27, is the youngest Obgyn to establish a privately owned network of women's health clinics, known for his cutting-edge research and patient-focused approach. Her hands trembled as she scrolled. Born into one of the wealthiest families in the country, Bennett chose medicine over family business, turning down a seat on the board of his father's global investment firm. Her throat tightened. Despite his financial success, Dr. Bennett remains dedicated to his work, often forgoing lavish social events in favor of expanding medical resources for underserved communities. Emma sat back, staring at the screen. She had known he was successful. That much had been obvious the moment she had walked into his clinic. But she hadn't realized he was this successful. That his name carried weight. That he had been born into a world of wealth and privilege so far removed from her own it felt laughable to even compare. She had been sitting across from a millionaire and casually talking about books. Oh, God. She shut the laptop and shoved it away like it had burned her. She was so stupid. For 1 second, one reckless second, she had let herself forget that men like him didn't belong in her world. She was just Emma Carter, a woman scraping by with freelance work, struggling to make rent, always one unexpected expense away from panic. And Lucas Bennett? He owned hospitals. She groaned, burying her face in her hands. What the hell had she been thinking? The answer was simple. She hadn't been. She had let herself get caught up in the fact that he was kind, that he had spoken to her like she mattered, that for some ridiculous reason he had noticed her. But that didn't change the truth. She was nothing like the women who probably surrounded him. The ones who came from wealth, who belonged in his circles, who didn't flinch at the idea of dating a man whose net worth had more zeros than she could comprehend. She couldn't be that girl, which meant there was only one thing to do. She had to avoid him. For good. So she ignored the clinic's calls. Let every follow-up reminder go unanswered. She stopped going to the cafe, choosing to make coffee at home instead. Days passed, then a week, then 2. It should have been easy. It should have made her feel relieved. But then one night, as she was getting ready for bed, she checked her phone out of habit and saw a missed call. Lucas Bennett. Her stomach twisted painfully. A text followed. You're avoiding me, aren't you? Emma's fingers hovered over the screen. She shouldn't answer. She wouldn't answer. But for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to delete the message either. Instead, she turned off her phone, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers over her head, hoping that if she ignored it long enough, the strange ache in her chest would disappear. It didn't. Emma had never been good at lying. Not to herself, and certainly not to anyone else. But for the past 2 weeks, she had done nothing but pretend. She pretended she wasn't avoiding Lucas. Pretended she didn't flinch every time her phone buzzed, half afraid it would be another text from him. Pretended she didn't feel the sharp pang of something stupidly close to regret every time she walked past the cafe and saw the seat he had once occupied sitting empty.
She was fine. She had to be.
Except, of course, life didn't believe in letting her run away so easily. She had just finished her shift at the bookstore, exhaustion weighing heavy on her limbs. The day had been long, filled with customers who took too long to decide, and a delivery shipment that had arrived 3 hours late. All she wanted was to go home, collapse onto her couch, and forget the world existed for a few hours. But the moment she stepped onto the sidewalk, her breath caught in her throat. He was there, leaning against a sleek black car parked by the curb, arms crossed, eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her stomach twist into knots. Lucas. Emma stopped short, her pulse kicking up in a frantic rhythm. She hadn't seen him in weeks, hadn't let herself even think about him beyond the late nights when she stared at her ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake. But now, standing in front of her, he looked exactly as she remembered. Effortlessly put together, his dress shirt crisp, the sleeves rolled up just enough to make her ridiculously aware of his forearms. His sharp blue eyes studied her with something unreadable, something that made it very, very clear that he wasn't here by accident. She swallowed hard. Lucas. His gaze didn't waver. So you are avoiding me. Her stomach sank. She should have denied it. Should have forced out a laugh and told him he was imagining things. But she couldn't lie. Not to him. Emma dropped her gaze to the pavement. I've just been busy. Lucas exhaled, pushing off the car. He took a step closer, and suddenly, it felt like all the air had been sucked from the space between them. Emma. His voice was quieter now, softer. Don't lie to me. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She wasn't ready for this. Wasn't ready to have this conversation, to admit to herself, or to him, why she had run. So she did what she did best. She deflected. Why does it even matter? She asked, lifting her chin. You, Lucas, and I'm me. We don't exist in the same world. Something flickered in his expression. Is that what you think? She let out a shaky breath. It's not about what I think. It's about what's true. You're a millionaire doctor, Lucas. You own hospitals. You've probably been surrounded by women who belong in your world. And me, she laughed, but it sounded hollow. I work at a bookstore part-time, just to make ends meet. I'm struggling to pay my rent next month. Do you have any idea how insane this is? Lucas stared at her for a long moment. Then, he laughed. Emma blinked, stunned. Why are you laughing? He shook his head, a breath of disbelief escaping him. Because, Emma, he murmured, taking another step closer. His voice laced with something she couldn't quite place. I think you might be the first person in my life who has ever run away from me because of my money. Emma's lips parted, but she had no words. Because for the first time, she saw it. The exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried, the way he looked at her, not as a doctor, not as a man who had everything, but as someone who had been waiting for her to see him. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure about running anymore. Emma wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the fact that Lucas had tracked her down just to confront her, or the fact that she had no good reason to keep running. Because after that night, something shifted. Lucas didn't chase her. He didn't flood her phone with texts or show up at her doorstep demanding an explanation. Instead, he simply appeared. At first, it was subtle. She'd be shelving books at work, and when she turned around, he'd be there, casually browsing through the new releases. He never stayed long, never made a scene. Never made a scene. Just a quiet presence, a nod, a small smirk as if to say, I'm not going anywhere. Then there was the cafe. The first time she saw him sitting in his usual spot by the window, she nearly turned around and walked right back out. But that would have been obvious, and the last thing she wanted was for him to know how much space he still occupied in her mind. So she stayed. She told herself she wasn't looking at him, that she wasn't hyper-aware of every time he shifted, every time he glanced up from whatever he was reading, that she didn't notice the way his lips curled slightly whenever he caught her, sneaking a look. It became a pattern, a strange, unspoken game. She never acknowledged him, and he never pushed. He was just there, a quiet, steady presence like a storm on the horizon she kept pretending wouldn't reach her. But storms had a way of catching up. One afternoon, as she was balancing a stack of books behind the counter, Lucas strolled in. Emma barely glanced up. "If you keep buying books at this rate, I'm going to start thinking you're not actually reading them." Lucas leaned against the counter, amused. Maybe I just like the customer service." Her fingers tightened around the book she was holding. "Flattery won't get you a discount." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. Good to know. Silence stretched between them. Emma swallowed, trying to ignore the way his presence filled the room, the way her pulse picked up just from being near him. After a beat, Lucas tilted his head.
"Are we ever going to talk about it?"
Her stomach twisted. "Talk about what?" He gave her a pointed look. "You avoiding me. The whole running away thing." Emma exhaled sharply, setting the book down with a little too much force. "Lucas, I—" The bell above the door jingled as a group of customers walked in. Emma almost sighed in relief, saved by the bell. Lucas glanced at the new arrivals, then back at her. He hesitated, as if debating whether to push further. But in the end, he just nodded. "I'll see you around, Emma." She didn't respond, because for the first time since this whole mess started, she wasn't sure if she wanted to run anymore. Emma told herself she was imagining things, that the way her heart skipped when Lucas walked into the bookstore was just nerves, that the warmth in his eyes, when he looked at her, didn't mean anything, that he wasn't waiting for her to let him in. But deep down, she knew better, because for all the times she had convinced herself that avoiding him was the best option, she had never stopped noticing him. And now, she had stopped running. It was a slow unraveling, one she tried to ignore. She no longer flinched when she saw him in the cafe. She no longer felt the urge to flee when he wandered into the bookstore. And worse, she anticipated his presence. She caught herself looking up when the bell above the shop door chimed, wondering if it was him. She lingered in the cafe longer than necessary, hoping for one of those fleeting moments where their eyes would meet, where he would smirk like he knew she was fighting this. And she was. Because even if she had stopped running, she had no idea how to move forward. But Lucas. Lucas was patient. He never pushed, never demanded answers. He simply showed up, giving her time, waiting for her to figure it out. And she hated how much she liked that. Then everything changed. It had been a long day at work, the kind that made her limbs heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't been feeling great all afternoon, but she had brushed it off as nothing. A headache, maybe a little dehydration. It was fine. She was fine. Until she wasn't. The world tilted when she stepped outside. The sounds of the city blurred, her vision swimming. She barely had time to process the sudden wave of dizziness before her knees buckled. Then, nothing. When she woke up, the first thing she felt was warmth. Soft sheets beneath her, the sterile scent of antiseptic in the air, the steady beep of a monitor somewhere close. The second thing she felt was a presence. She turned her head, her movement sluggish. Lucas was sitting beside her bed, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. He looked tired, his usually sharp features drawn with concern. His dark hair was slightly mussed, like he had been running his hands through it. The moment her eyes fluttered open, he exhaled sharply, relief flooding his expression. "Emma," he murmured, his voice raw, "you scared the hell out of me." She blinked, her throat dry. "What? What happened?" "You collapsed," he said, his jaw tight. On the street. Someone called an ambulance. He hesitated, his gaze searching her face. I came as soon as I found out you were here. Something in her chest clenched painfully. She shouldn't be surprised. Of course he had come. That was who he was. Steady. Unshakable. Always showing up. But this was different. This wasn't him casually teasing her in the bookstore or watching her over the rim of his coffee cup. This was real. He had been worried. For her. And suddenly, all the walls she had built, all the reasons she had convinced herself to stay away, felt so small. Lucas leaned forward slightly. You're dehydrated, exhausted. You've been pushing yourself too hard. His voice softened. You need to take better care of yourself, Emma. She swallowed, turning her gaze toward the ceiling. You don't have to be here. Lucas went very still. Her fingers curled weakly into the hospital blanket. I don't need your charity, she whispered. Lucas inhaled slowly, as if forcing himself to stay calm. Then, in a voice quiet but firm, he said, This isn't charity, Emma. She didn't look at him. You think I'm here because I feel obligated? His tone was sharper now, frustration creeping in, because I don't have anything better to do than sit in a hospital room for hours. She swallowed hard, guilt clawing at her chest. Lucas let out a slow breath. Then, softly, because it's you, Emma. Her throat tightened. You think I have everything? He continued. That my life is perfect. That I don't know what it feels like to wonder if you're enough. She frowned, startled by the edge of vulnerability in his voice. Lucas leaned back slightly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I wasn't always like this. I didn't grow up with money the way people assume. My parents worked hard. I put myself through med school with scholarships and part-time jobs. Emma stared at him, her pulse unsteady. When I finally made something of myself, I thought I had everything I wanted. He let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. And then I met someone I thought loved me. A chill ran down her spine. Lucas's jaw tightened. She didn't love me, Emma. She loved my name, my money, what I could give her. Emma's chest ached. I haven't really let anyone in since then, he admitted. I told myself I didn't need to. That it was easier this way. He looked at her then, his blue eyes burning into hers. But then I met you. The air left her lungs. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. And I can't. I won't. Emma's heart pounded, the weight of his words settling over her like a storm she couldn't escape. Because for the first time, she realized, maybe she didn't want to. Emma had never been good at handling raw, unfiltered honesty, especially not when it came from Lucas Bennett. His words still echoed in her head, heavy and impossible to ignore. Because it's you, Emma. I won't pretend like this is nothing. She wanted to argue, to tell him that he was wrong, that this was nothing, that they were from different worlds and she didn't belong in his. But the way he had looked at her, like she was worth something, like he meant every word, had stolen whatever excuses she might have clung to. And now, lying in a hospital bed, too weak to run, she had to face the one thing she had spent weeks avoiding. Him. Lucas hadn't left. He was still there, still watching her with that steady, unshakable presence that made it impossible to ignore just how much he cared. And it terrified her. Because she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he wasn't like the men from her past, the ones who only saw what they could take from her. She wanted to believe that he saw her, really saw her, really saw her. But believing meant trusting. And trusting meant risking. And Emma had never been good at taking risks. She swallowed, turning her gaze toward the window. You didn't have to stay. Lucas let out a soft, humorless chuckle. You keep saying that? Because it's true, she whispered. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. No, Emma, it's not. His voice was quieter now, but there was something firm underneath it. Something unshakable. I wanted to stay. Her fingers curled into the hospital blanket. You scared the hell out of me, he admitted, rubbing a hand over his jaw. When I got the call, I didn't even think. I just ran. Emma's breath hitched. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. And the entire time, I kept wondering if this was it. If this was the moment I realized I'd lost you before I ever even had the chance to know you. Her heart clenched. She had spent so long trying to keep her distance, telling herself that she was protecting herself, that running was the only way to keep things from falling apart before they even began. But now, hearing the way his voice broke just slightly at the end, she realized something awful. She wasn't the only one who was scared. Lucas might have been successful. He might have had wealth, confidence, and a career that made him untouchable. But he wasn't invincible. He had been hurt, just like her. And maybe, just maybe, he was just as afraid of this as she was. Emma swallowed past the lump in her throat. Lucas. He shook his head, sitting back slightly. Don't push me away, Emma. Her chest tightened. I know you're scared, he continued. And I get it. But don't. He exhaled sharply. She blinked. What? Lucas met her gaze, unwavering. Don't decide for me that I'm better off without you. Her breath caught. Don't assume I want someone else, someone who fits into whatever picture you have in your head. His voice softened. I want you, Emma. Silence stretched between them. Emma's throat burned. She didn't know how to do this. She didn't know how to let someone like Lucas in. But when she looked at him, at the exhaustion in his eyes, at the quiet, steady patience in the way he waited for her to say something, she realized she didn't want to run anymore. She just didn't know how to stay. So she did the only thing she could do. She nodded, just once. Lucas's expression didn't change. He didn't look victorious, didn't smirk like he had won something. He just nodded back, like he understood, like he knew this was going to take time. And for the first time in weeks, Emma let herself believe. Just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she could figure out how to let him in. Emma had never felt more unsteady in her life. She had spent weeks running, convincing herself that keeping Lucas at a distance was the only way to protect herself. But now, sitting in a hospital bed with his unwavering gaze locked onto hers, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want to run anymore. She had nodded. A single, almost imperceptible movement. But somehow, it had felt like the biggest decision of her life. Lucas hadn't pushed. He hadn't demanded anything from her. He had simply waited, his patience stretching between them like a quiet promise. And that was what scared her the most. Because Emma Carter didn't know how to be wanted like this. Not for what she could offer. Not for what she could give. Just for being her. A nurse entered the room before she could say anything, breaking the tension. "Miss Carter, your vitals are looking much better. The doctor will be in soon to discuss your discharge." Emma barely heard her. Her heart was still racing, her skin still tingling from the weight of Lucas's words. She expected him to leave then. Expected him to say something polite and professional. Something that would allow her to slip back into the comfort of distance. But he didn't move. When the nurse left, Lucas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His gaze softened, but there was something unreadable beneath it. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted quietly. Lucas tilted his head slightly. "Do what?" Emma swallowed hard, feeling her pulse thrum in her throat. "Let someone like you in." His jaw tensed for just a moment before he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Emma," he murmured, his voice softer now, careful. "I'm not expecting you to have it all figured out." She looked away. "I don't know if I can figure it out." A beat of silence. Then, "You don't have to do it alone." Her breath hitched. Lucas sat back slightly, watching her carefully. "You think I don't know what it feels like to be scared?" Emma's fingers curled into the hospital blanket. "You think I don't understand what it means to second? Guess everything?" He let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. She forced herself to look at him. "How?" Lucas exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much to say. Then, "I told you about her." Emma knew exactly who he meant. The woman who had used him. The one who had taught him that love could be a lie. His expression darkened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "I let myself believe in something that wasn't real. I let myself trust her. And when it all fell apart, I told myself I wouldn't make that mistake again." He hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee. "For a long time, I thought the safest thing to do was to keep people at a distance." Emma swallowed hard. Lucas met her gaze. "And then I met you."
She felt her heart stutter.
He shook his head slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I didn't expect this, Emma. I didn't expect you." She couldn't breathe. "But I do know that I don't want to lose you before we even have a chance." His voice was low now, quiet but firm. "So if you need time, I'll give it to you. If you need space, I'll take a step back. But I need you to know something." Emma couldn't look away. His fingers brushed against hers, just barely. A whisper of a touch. "I want to be here," he murmured, "for as long as you'll let me." Her chest tightened painfully, because for the first time in her life, she believed him. Emma had spent her entire life believing that love, real love, was something fragile. Something conditional, something conditional, something that could be given just as easily as it could be taken away. But Lucas Bennett wasn't fragile. And he wasn't walking away. Even after she told him she didn't know how to do this. Even after she admitted that letting him in scared her more than anything else. He had simply looked at her, steady and sure, and said, "I want to be here. For as long as you'll let me." And somehow, those words had unraveled something inside her. Because no one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever meant it. For days after she was discharged from the hospital, Emma found herself thinking about him more than she should have. About the way his voice had softened when he spoke to her. About the way he had looked at her, as if she was someone worth waiting for. She had always thought that falling for someone would be loud, chaotic, a reckless kind of freefall. But this was quiet, slow, like the tide rolling in, space between them, and no matter how hard she tried to fight it, she couldn't ignore one simple truth. She missed him. So when she walked into the cafe one afternoon, her pulse stuttered at the sight of him sitting at his usual table. Lucas looked up just as she stepped inside, his blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, his lips curled into the kind of smile that made her heart ache. Not smug, not expectant. Just there. Just him. And that was when Emma realized she didn't want to fight this anymore. So instead of turning around, instead of pretending she hadn't seen him, she did something she never would have done weeks ago. She walked over to his table and sat down. Lucas arched a brow, his smile deepening. "Fancy seeing you here." Emma exhaled, shaking her head. "I think we both know it's not a coincidence at this point." His chuckle was warm, easy. "No, I suppose not." For the first time in weeks, sitting across from him didn't feel like something she had to survive. It just was. And maybe, just maybe, she was okay with that. Emma hadn't expected it to feel this easy. For weeks, she had convinced herself that sitting across from Lucas meant unraveling, that letting him in meant losing control. But now, with the scent of coffee curling in the air and the hum of quiet conversations around them, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. She felt safe. They talked about nothing and everything: books, travel, the best way to make a proper cup of coffee. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like they had been doing this for years instead of cautiously circling each other for weeks. And Emma let herself enjoy it. She let herself fall into the rhythm of his voice, let herself meet his gaze without flinching, let herself be there without questioning whether she had the right to be. For the first time, she stopped thinking about all the reasons this shouldn't work. And for the first time, she let herself imagine what it would be like if it did. But the moment it started to feel real, reality crashed back in. It happened when Lucas checked his watch, exhaling softly. "I have to head to the hospital soon." Late shift. Emma nodded, trying to ignore the way disappointment curled in her stomach. "Of course." Lucas hesitated, studying her for a beat. "But I was thinking—" He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, softer. "Maybe we could do this again. Intentionally this time." Her breath caught. He was asking her on a date. A real one.
No excuses, no coincidence, just them.
Emma's heart pounded, her pulse stumbling over itself. And for a moment, a fleeting, reckless moment, she wanted to say yes. But then, a thought struck her. Lucas Bennett wasn't just any man. He wasn't just someone she had met by chance. He was successful, wealthy, the kind of person who lived in a world so different from hers that it almost felt laughable. And she was just Emma. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. Lucas. His gaze flickered, his expression unreadable. "Emma," he said slowly, like he could already hear the hesitation in her voice. She swallowed hard. "Are you sure about this?" His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She forced out a breath, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "I mean, us." "This," she gestured between them. "Are you sure this isn't just something temporary?" Lucas exhaled sharply, sitting back. "Why would you think that?" Emma let out a short, breathless laugh. "Because look at us, Lucas. Lucas. You have everything. and I'm still trying to figure out how to keep my life together one day at a time." His jaw tightened. "That's not. I just don't want to be someone people think is chasing you because of who you are," she admitted, her voice quieter now. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. Then, after a beat, he let out a low, humorless chuckle. Emma stiffened. "What?" Lucas shook his head, running a hand through his hair. Her stomach twisted. "Get what?" He leaned forward again, his voice lower now, rough around the edges. "Emma, I think you might be the first person in my life who's ever run away from me because of my money." Her breath hitched, because for all the ways she had tried to convince herself that she and Lucas were too different, she hadn't thought about what it was like for him. Lucas, who had spent his whole life surrounded by people who only saw his name, his wealth, his success. Lucas, who had been betrayed before. Lucas, who had chosen her, not because she fit into his world, but because she didn't. Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight. Lucas's expression softened. "Then let's figure it out together." Her chest ached, because for the first time, she thought maybe, just maybe, she wanted to try. Emma had spent so long convincing herself that she wasn't enough, that she and Lucas lived in two separate worlds, divided by things she could never bridge: status, wealth, expectations, wealth, expectations. But Lucas had never let that stop him. And now, as she sat across from him, his steady gaze holding hers, she realized something terrifying. She wanted this. She wanted him. Even if it scared her, even if she didn't know how to let herself believe in something real. So, she made a choice. She nodded, barely more than a breath, but Lucas saw it. He always saw her. A slow smile tugged at his lips, something quiet and knowing. Emma exhaled shakily. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a grand declaration. But it was real. And for Lucas, that was enough. The days that followed weren't some sweeping, dramatic romance. They were something quieter, something steady. Lucas didn't push. He never demanded more than she could give. He just showed up. He texted her good morning before his shifts. He stopped by the bookstore, sometimes just to say hi, sometimes to buy books he probably didn't have time to read. He walked her home when it got late, teasing her about how she always got lost in her thoughts. And slowly, carefully, Emma let herself believe. It wasn't easy. Some days, she still heard the voice in the back of her head, whispering that she wasn't enough. That Lucas would wake up one day and realize she didn't belong in his world. But every time that fear crept in, he was there. In the quiet moments. In the steady, unshakable way he made space for her in his life. And then, one day, he asked her to meet him at the cafe. Emma didn't think much of it at first. She had grown used to their routine, to the way Lucas had become her safe place. But when she walked in and saw him sitting there, fidgeting with his coffee cup, something in her chest tightened. Lucas Bennett didn't fidget. Her heart started pounding. Lucas. He looked up, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked nervous. Emma's stomach flipped. And then he stood and dropped to one knee. The cafe fell silent. Emma's breath caught, her pulse roaring in her ears as Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Emma Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "I know you never expected this. Hell, maybe I didn't either, but there's not a single part of me that doubts what I feel for you." Her chest ached. Lucas exhaled, his thumb brushing over the box in his hand. "You once told me you didn't know how to let someone in. That you didn't know how to let someone in. You didn't know how to believe in this. He looked up at her, his blue eyes burning with something raw. But Emma, I do. I believe in us. Her vision blurred. I don't care about what I have, or what I don't. I don't care that we come from different worlds. The only thing that matters to me is that you're in mine. He let out a soft chuckle. And I plan to keep it that way. If you'll let me? Emma's hands were shaking. A year ago, she would have run. A year ago, she would have convinced herself that she wasn't enough, that this wasn't real. But now she knew better. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, yes. Lucas's breath hitched. Yeah. She nodded, laughing through her tears. Yeah. The cafe erupted into cheers, but Emma barely heard them. All she could hear was the steady thrum of her own heartbeat. And all she could see was the man in front of her, the one who had never let her go, even when she had tried to push him away. Lucas slid the ring onto her finger, his hand steady, even as his jaw clenched like he was trying not to let the moment break him. Then he stood, cupping her face in his hands, and kissed her like he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. And maybe he had. Because love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about grand gestures or fairy tales. It was about choosing someone, over and over again. And as Emma melted into Lucas's arms, she knew. She would choose him, too. Life's greatest lesson: love is a choice. At its core, this story isn't just about romance. It's about choosing to believe in yourself, in others, and in the possibility of something greater than fear. Emma spent so much of her life convinced that she wasn't enough, that love, security, and happiness were things meant for other people, not for her. But Lucas showed her that love isn't about perfection or fitting into someone else's world. Love is about showing up, again and again. We all carry scars, past experiences that whisper we are unworthy, that we should guard our hearts, that we are better off alone. But the truth is, love doesn't require grand gestures or fairy tale endings. It requires patience, trust, and the courage to let someone see you exactly as you are. Lucas didn't save Emma. He didn't fix her insecurities or change her life overnight. What he did was much more important. He stayed. He proved in small, steady moments that love isn't about chasing someone who doesn't want to be caught. It's about standing still and letting them find their way to you. And when they do, you choose them, over and over again. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Soul, Stirring Stories for more emotional, heartfelt journeys. Until next time, believe in love, in second chances, and in the magic of the unexpected. See you soon